So you may have seen I posted yesterday how I can kill a dummy within 36 seconds on Wand Orb, and this is on nowhere near a maxed out build. Yes, I know, compared to Orb with crossbow, this may not seem like crazy damage. And well, we have already got announced by the developers that Orb crossbow combination along with Orb staff combination is getting nerfed. Now, we don't know how those nerfs are going to be implemented, but my hunch is simply to have temporal leap, the cooldown reduction, to not affect the majority of staff abilities like Hellfire Rain and High Focus in particular. And in terms of Orb crossbow, they can very simply change Stellar Dash, the weaken effect, to not apply to Selfless Diffusion. And that would very simply result in both weapon combos dealing significantly less damage. And what will happen is builds like this, Wand and Orb, will come into the light. Now I get similar damage here as I do on Fury, which before those broken Orb combos was one of the top damage dealers. So it looks pretty promising for Orb Wand, on top of the fact you have all that extra Wand self-sustain with Vampiric Contract. And so let's go through everything you need to know how to play Wand and Orb, also known as Oracle, as a damage dealer. I have a fully fleshed out quest log here with a direct path upgrade. So you will start out with Path of Ascension. That is completing this right here. Step 1 will already give you that maxed out tier 2 equipment, along with step 2, those earrings. And so simply copy exactly step 1, everything here, and get those runes slotted in. You will work on leveling them up, but Path of Ascension will give you a ton of them, so you'll get caught up pretty quick. Progressing on to step 2, we get some gear upgrades, like tier 3 items, new weapons, this cloak, some armor pieces, and accessories. All super accessible. This build you'll be able to do just by playing your co-op dungeons here. I do recommend this Orb of Reaping right here. It is the tier 3 variant, but you may see other people recommending the Shadowy Sphere from the Contract Coin Merchant, and it is the orb I'm currently using. However, the bonus you don't make much use of, and the reason is because you actually want to combine Milky Way with Stellar Dash in order to give it that damage boost. And so simply waiting a second longer before casting Stellar Dash is more worth it than simply reducing its cooldown and ruining this synergy. I will talk more about that in the rotations, but ultimately this magical harmony is not very useful to us, not here on Wand Orb, and so we want this tier 3 orb instead from the co-op dungeon, or you buy it with Fortitude coins. Similarly, the wand from the co-op dungeon or with Fortitude coins, and this would be the best one to go with, just because of all those sheer amount of stats and the max damage. However, of course, if you're at the endgame level, you would have Tevent's wand, maybe even Deckman's wand, but this Lucian's wand is near enough those, just in terms of the sheer amount of stats it gives. So once you get to this stage, you've got these tier 3 accessories, tier 3 armor pieces, and the tier 2 spectral set. Now this is debatable whether you want to get it. You could buy it from the auction as a lithograph and craft it, or you can save up the loyalty coins, and that is an option now, but that's a lot of loyalty coins and you can trade each one for an unlock stone, so maybe that's just not worth it. But once you get to the end game level, as far as I'm aware, the best bet would be the full blood hunter set here, but it is not that accessible looking at the prices here on EU. But if you have the spare Lucent, I'm pretty sure this would be the go-to. There is a measure of doubt, and that is the fact the tier 2 sacred set, which gives you this damage over time, could be competitive here. It could even be slightly better. From my tests, I couldn't really come to a concrete conclusion, and I want to do some more mathematical breakdowns, but I will wait for the orb nerfs if they potentially affect orb and wand. But for now, I've been running the budget option, which is my older tier 2 spectral set for the crit damage, and the new Brute Slayer set, the 2 pieces from the co-op dungeon, along with these new accessories. And you will then want to be getting legendary gear by doing your raids, and that's when you get to step 3 here. Getting the legendary orb, it's actually better than the legendary wand because of the base damage difference. This wand here is only a tiny bit behind the legendary wand, and there's a bigger difference between the tier 3 orb and the legendary orb, so go with the legendary orb if you're starting out. I already have the legendary wand and I have no intention of transferring that to the legendary orb. So you would go with it, you would get these stats. Sometimes instead of the cooldown, you may go with strength. That's a viable option, particularly when running with groups with deadly markers. You don't need this extra cooldown. With the ring, simply getting all these attributes. And once you do get to the end game level, it's simply hunting for the Band of Brutal Agony, getting that, and the Necklace of Morning Mist. The alternative one being this from the co-op dungeons. And then of course the Full Blood Hunter set. And that gets you 99 on Dexterity, Wisdom, Perception. And this should be your full step-by-step on how to progress with your gear with this class. Yes, with the wand, there's the option to have Tevent. It's technically the best because you're also going to reduce the target's defense, supporting your entire team dealing more damage against the target, along with that extra damage over time, contributing to Curse Explosions. Deckments is also a very viable option, so you don't have to cast Magic Circle, which has quite annoying cast time, and then gain that benefit directly on Ray of Disaster, which you will use, and it has pretty good stats. And keep in mind you can make a bunch of switches to end up with extra max health, extra skill damage resistance if you're dying in high level content, and that simply requires like artifact switches and rune switches here, like going with max health instead of max mana. Max mana is what you want because of the benefit right here, Noble Revival, with the Mastery Warrior's Gambit, converting all that max mana percentage into base damage. So now let's get into how to actually play Wand and Orb, now that we have what kind of gear you want to be going for. Again, recommend just checking quest log here, and it will cover everything you need to know in terms of what runes, how you want to set them up. I have on the earlier steps without chaos runes, and you'll simply just go with those until you ultimately do get chaos runes, as you would see here, replacing a bunch of them with boss magic heavy attack mainly, or skill damage boost. And all the traits are selected here with the resonance effects, legendary traits, so on. But now that we jump to how to actually play and to set up Wand and Orb, you can see the skill setup I have here along with these specializations. Just keep in mind there are a few things I switch depending on the scenario. Right now, this setup is what I would use when you're the top damage dealer and you're tanking for the group. So let's go over some explanations and how this all works. So in terms of Wand, you have these specializations, and the main damage source is going to be Curse Explosion, along with the mini Curse Explosions from Abyssal Burst. Now you will gain the majority of your damage over time through Corrupting Hit, through basic attacks. That is going to be supported by Orb, which should allow you to have a high attack speed, get extra damage hits on basic attacks, along with its seriously high hit count. The more hits per second you have, the more mini explosions, and so we will mainly just use Touch of Despair followed by Curse Explosion, getting that extra damage based on the remaining duration of all your damage over times, multiplied by the damage they would deal per tick. Enchanting Time and Valorous Barrier are simply buffs like skill damage boost and max damage. Ray of Disaster is some filler damage, just some extra hits which again have a chance to trigger those mini explosions. When we jump to Orb, this is where things get a little bit more interesting. You're going to want to use Star Calling to simply summon your orbs. And once you have them in play, you should never need to activate them again with this ability, unless something happens that you can't cast this ability, which is Milky Way. Milky Way should have a 6-second cooldown. At base it has 12 seconds, and this is where gear becomes important for this build to actually work. You ideally want to have a build, even on step 2 here, with 100% cooldown. What this does is it halves the cooldown of Milky Way, making it just 6 seconds rather than 12, as you see at the base there. That means every time you cast this, you refresh the duration of your orbs, which normally lasts 6 seconds plus 1.5. So once you have these orbs down, and as long as you cast Milky Way, as soon as it comes off cooldown, you will always be able to maintain having those orbs and never need to cast them again through this ability, which just saves you that attack, freeing you up to cast other abilities. Now, when you do cast Milky Way, you have this damage boost, and to make the most of that, you want to follow it up with Stellar Dash. This applies a ton of extra hits based on all those orbs, along with your satellite buff, which you're going to apply to yourself and for a shorter duration on all of your allies within range. Void Stash is simply just some extra damage causing your orbs to burst, dealing a bunch of damage. It doesn't consume the orbs, so they're not going away. You can continue to keep refreshing them with Milky Way. And then you have Distortion Veil, which right now you can see we don't have Amplification Veil. But if we want to min-max our damage, say we're in solo content, we wouldn't use Satellite Copy since we don't have allies nearby, and we could use this instead. If we are in party content and we're not tanking, we ideally want to have this Satellite Copy just to get all those extra damage hits from our allies. And then you need to scrounge up 7 specialization points to throw in here. Maybe you end up with a build with enough cooldown that you can keep using Milky Way and sustaining your orbs, and so you can get those specializations right there. And this is what I would recommend once you get the legendary orb and you can use False Time, meaning your Stellar Dash will directly increase the duration of your orbs. This comes from the Grey Eye Sinister Sphere. For Wand and Orb, there just isn't really any other good bonus that you could be using. We don't use the abilities from Tevent, otherwise this may be a good option, and it could be viable if I can get this tested out. And we could throw in Star Destroyer as an optional ability. Come to think of it, we actually don't need the reduced resource cost here, and so we can throw those points into Ray of Disaster instead. I'll explain mana management in a section at the end of the video. So hopefully that explains the skills, the specializations, and how they really work, but it ultimately ends up with a rotation like this. Again, always have your orbs out, and then use these 4 abilities as buffs, followed by Milky Way and Stellar Dash. You always wait for Milky Way to be off cooldown before you cast Stellar Dash, just so you give it its damage boost. And then you always try and cast Touch of Despair before Dark Explosion to make sure you're refreshing its duration and getting that boost to the explosion. Void Slash is simply filler, you use it when it's off cooldown, same with Ray of Disaster, and you can potentially use Corrupted Magic Circle. Ideally you would cast this before you use Dark Explosion to make the most of its duration. But I'm not so sure about this ability. I mainly use it for multi-target to make sure I'm applying a curse to lots of enemies around me so that I gain all that healing through Vampiric Contract. But now we will have a look at masteries. For Orb, this is what I recommend. You can see the full priority step by step depending on what level you have. They are not like super game changing, they're just simply going to be damage buffs and stats that help you improve your damage. I would, however, recommend pushing to get Seer as soon as possible. This just gives you a 26% heavy attack boost on your satellite, which you're going to have pretty much 100% uptime on with this kind of a build, and you can see that right here, 126% heavy attack. Normally you only have 100%. On the step 2 build, we managed to obtain that, but you are sacrificing a little bit of attack speed by going with these weapon rune synergies for an extra 4 perception each. And at 70 again is what you need in order to successfully get this effect. Now if we look at wand masteries, this is what I would generally recommend. Again, step 1, 2, 3, so on, depending on how many you have. But in order to make wand work, you really need to have at least level 90, gaining that abyssal burst. And it's really important you have corrupting hit here for that, to apply those dots. You do have the option to go more offensively to get Vampiric Onslaught, giving up the self heals. And so in order to take advantage of that, you will simply make a switch like removing these points, putting them over here, removing say Nightmare and putting them over here. Then you can remove this one and reapply it, and now it's switched. But this is what I usually go with and I would recommend for anybody starting out in this class. And of course, if you are going with Vampiric Onslaught, you can give up using Full of Corruption and you could use Astral Overseer instead. So finally, I want to talk about mana. This can be a big issue, and it can look like a big issue, not actually necessarily being one. For example, this test right here, we start out with only like 1,300 mana, and lasting 36 seconds, and we're still at about 1,900 mana. So it's not like this build actually uses a lot of mana, it's just your mana will be really low. And the reason behind this is because for every orb you have out, it's going to suck 1% of your current mana. So the more mana you have, the more cut it's going to take. Like if I have 10,000 mana, 3% of that is going to be 300 mana per second draining down. So when you only have 1,000 mana, you're losing only 3%, which is 30 mana per second. And that becomes an awful lot more manageable. And that's why you're going to have to get used to looking at your mana and seeing how seriously low it is. This is just something normal. And if you see people playing Orb, expect them to have low mana because of the way the Orb drain works. The more mana you have, the more mana those orbs will be draining. And the lower the mana you have, the less amount of mana the orbs are going to drain. And it's going to be up to you where the balance is in order to be able to sustain your mana based on your mana cost efficiency and your mana regen, and also depending on the fight. Some fights, they boss phases, and there will be a bit of a downtime where you're not casting abilities. If I look at my build right now, this mana regen would be where I'm pretty comfortable. Now this is in a safe space, so my mana is actually only about 1,200, and that's with 84% mana cost efficiency, which gets boosted by 15% through the orb mastery right here. And again, your mana is going to be low, and that's just something you're going to have to get used to, like I said, and it's only at that low point where orbs do not suck much mana at all, and your mana regen will be able to keep up along with your mana cost efficiency with all the skills you're casting. So you're probably going to want to go with mana regen runes on some of your gear here rather than max mana, which means you are giving up a little bit of damage, but it's going to be a must if you're in long fights and you have to sustain that mana. There is an alternative route as well in terms of exact skills, and that is using this one right here, Stellar Cycle. You're going to have to give up something, potentially Wraith's Beacon, and you can use Interstellar Explosion. Maybe I give up Magic Circle right there. So what this does is whenever I have these orbs down and I use this Interstellar Explosion, it's going to consume those orbs and give me back mana. And it's going to give me double mana when I'm below 50%. So I'm going to get over 1,000 mana for those 3 orbs when I use this ability. And you'll simply use that ability while you have these orbs out, and you're using Milky Way to simply refresh the duration of those orbs. And by the time you can see here that you have those charges left on your orbs and you cast then this Interstellar, you can immediately cast those orbs again as soon as they're exploded. And this, if you put this into your rotation, you can pretty comfortably manage your mana here. It's just about getting used to that combo. It is actually not bad at all. I tested it out in dealing damage and you will barely lose anything. It's just about not having as much attacks per second, and you won't really have much time for basic attacks, which means you aren't reapplying those curses through Corrupting Hit as much. So I would say it's slightly less optimal, but again, there's going to be a balance whether you want to use that route, using that ability. It can be totally worth it. It's got good damage, and simply reapplying these orbs also does some decent damage. But you are giving up a passive that would otherwise give you a damage boost, and it is again taking up more cast time versus casting a few basic attacks in between. But on the flip side, you might instead have to get mana regen instead of max mana. You might have to get mana cost efficiency instead of some heavy attack chaos runes and so on. So it's going to be up to you to find the balance, but I hope I've been clear to help you find your own. Ultimately, do not freak out when your build looks like it's struggling on mana because you're only at like 1,000. That is totally normal. That's how the way mana works with Orb. There's not much point having an insane amount of mana regen and keeping it like above 1,000 just because you think it looks better. The more mana, the more current mana you have, the more these orbs are going to drain that away. Again, 3% when you have 10,000 mana is going to be 300 mana per second. If you only have 1,000 mana, you're only draining 30 mana per second. And so easily 1 mana regen rune is going to keep up the upkeep of all 3 orbs when you're at only 1,000 mana. So with that said, thanks all for watching. A special thank you to these channel members, and we'll see you guys around.